What truly defines evil? What makes a mind appear completely devoid of any emotion, except for a sinister purpose? Michael Myers, a figure of horror without a clear motive, raises complex questions about what resides within an unshaken mind. In this series, we will explore the scientific and psychological theories behind a soul seemingly beyond redemption. Get ready, what follows will alter your perception of evil. It all began in an ordinary house, on an ordinary street, in a town where nothing seemed out of place. Haddonfield, Illinois. A perfect suburb, trimmed lawns, children running along the sidewalks in autumn. But inside one house, hidden behind vacant eyes, was a silence that had nothing to do with peace. Michael Myers was born there, amidst what appeared to be a normal life. No outward signs. No apparent tragedy. And yet, something felt off from the very beginning. The neighbors remember a quiet, introspective child, almost invisible. Teachers noted his lack of interaction. Words were scarce. Eye contact, even rarer. In childhood, it's normal to imagine, play, explore. Michael did none of that. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, as if he wasn't even there. Child psychologists call this early emotional detachment, a state in which a child fails to form healthy emotional bonds with others, not even with parents. The family structure was unstable. There was coldness, distance, and an absence of emotional validation. There weren't necessarily physical abuses, but the home functioned like an ice field, slippery, hard, unpredictable. Modern studies indicate that children exposed to emotionally neglectful households can develop antisocial traits even before puberty. The brain, especially the limbic system, responsible for emotion, begins to form differently, prioritizing self-preservation over empathy. Michael was one of those children. And while adults only saw shyness, the signs were already there, between the lines. He showed no guilt, never apologized, didn't react to the suffering of others. In clinical psychology, this can be the beginning of what is known as childhood conduct disorder, which in extreme cases evolves into dissociative personality disorders. But in Michael, it seemed even deeper. He didn't just ignore the feelings of others, he appeared incapable of understanding them. Even in his earliest school drawings, the human figures were erased, empty, faceless. And that visual absence mirrored what was hidden inside him, an interior without emotional identity. In interviews years later, one of his former classmates said, "He was like a wall. You talked, and nothing came back." The lack of emotional reciprocity became a pattern, a constant. It was as if Michael was among us, but operating on a different frequency, where human emotion simply didn't exist. And then, on that Halloween night, when Michael was only 6 years old, everything changed. An act with no motive. No emotion. No hesitation. It was the spark no one saw coming, but one that had been building for years, silently, like an invisible crack in an apparently solid wall. Psychologists would later say that moment wasn't a breakdown, but the result of a long process of emotional dissociation. He didn't snap, he had been fractured from the start. But there was something no one saw coming. Michael Myers wasn't just absence. He was the embodiment of a kind of mind that science still struggles to understand, one that does not feel, does not react, and does not belong. And that mind was only beginning to show what it was capable of. The lights of the patrol car were still flashing when Michael was taken away. That night, a mask covered his face, but it wasn't the Halloween disguise that frightened everyone. It was what lay behind the mask, or rather, what didn't. No reaction, no tears, no plea for explanation. The psychiatrist assigned to his case, Dr. Samuel Loomis, wrote in his report, "Michael isn't here. There is no one here." That sentence, which at first sounded like a metaphor, became the central axis of the study that would come to define the case. Michael's mind didn't fragment after the incident. In fact, it solidified. As if, by committing that act, he had finally found a form of existence, not emotional, but functional. For the first time, Michael was no longer adrift, there was an internal drive guiding him. And no, it wasn't rage. It was something colder. A logic without emotion. During the early years of his institutionalization, he remained in absolute silence. MRI scans revealed something rare: low levels of activity in the areas associated with empathy, morality, and emotional decision-making. The prefrontal cortex, typically active during reflective processes, appeared almost switched off. The doctors didn't know what to do. The child in front of them did not respond to positive or negative stimuli. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. And yet, he was fully aware. What many interpreted as psychosis, more modern studies would associate with severe dissociative disorder. In certain individuals, the mind builds internal barriers so dense they create a functional void, a kind of capsule where pain, remorse, and empathy cannot enter. But in Michael's case, that void didn't seem to be a defense mechanism. It was his natural way of existing. There was no specific trauma. The trauma, perhaps, was the absence of emotion itself. The sessions with Loomis became iconic. He looked at me like I was a white wall. There was no anger, no rebellion. Just silence. Loomis began to understand that he wasn't facing a wounded child, but a completely isolated mental pattern. An emotional architecture without windows. Records show that Michael began developing an internal routine, repetitive movements, long periods of stillness, staring at a single point on the wall. There was no boredom. There was focus. By the time he turned 15, Michael had become a complete enigma. No progress. No regression. Just stagnation. But Loomis noticed a subtle change: the silence was no longer empty. It was calculated. As if he were waiting. Observing. Learning. His gaze, once vacant, now fixed on faces, as if he were studying human behavior without ever being a part of it. And it was during this phase that something began, what Loomis would later call the imitation of presence. A primitive attempt to move among the living without truly being one of them. The trigger, it seems, was not an external event. It was a slow, internal reconstruction. Michael stopped being a strange child and became an observant presence. It was no longer about impulsiveness, but about patience. He didn't need to express himself. He only needed to wait for the right moment. And that moment would come. Silently, like everything that had shaped him. And it was then that everything began to collapse. Not just within Michael, but in those who tried to understand him. Because what they called emptiness might have been an unknown form of presence. Something without a name, but not without intention. At 21 years old, Michael Myers was no longer the vacant-eyed boy who had been institutionalized. He had become a living structure of silence, calculation, and absence. For 15 years, he remained motionless in the eyes of the world, but inside, something was growing, a kind of logic that required no words, only direction. When he escaped from the maximum security hospital, there was no emotional outburst, no screams, no chaos. He simply disappeared. As if returning to a place he had always belonged. The doctors classified his escape as a security failure. But Loomis knew better. It wasn't an escape. It was a decision. Michael wasn't running. He was walking. With purpose. As if following a plan silently nurtured for over a decade. It was a raw, primitive intelligence, but with a disturbing clarity. And once again, his face was covered by a mask, not to hide, but to affirm what he had become, a presence without identity, without expression. A walking idea. In criminal psychology, this type of behavior is classified as cold processing, a state where the individual does not respond to emotions but to patterns. Michael operated by his own rules, invisible to ordinary eyes but clear to him. He returned to Haddonfield not out of nostalgia, but because it was where it all began, and perhaps where it all should be completed. The neighborhood was the same. Houses lined up, manicured lawns, windows glowing warmly from inside. A world of apparent normalcy. But Michael saw differently. His eyes were cameras. He didn't see people. He saw movement, patterns, distractions. There was no rush in his actions. He observed, recorded, advanced. The suburban routine became a map he navigated without being noticed. Meanwhile, Loomis tried to warn the authorities. "You don't understand. He's not running away. He's coming back." But no one listened. After all, how could you fear someone who doesn't run? Who doesn't scream? Who doesn't respond? That was the essence of the terror Michael embodied. He wanted nothing. He sought no revenge, no redemption, no glory. His impulse had no name, only direction. Science compared his condition to what is called profound alexithymia, a state where the brain fails to recognize or process one's own or others' emotions. But in Michael, it was not a disorder. It was a resource. He wasn't a broken mind but a shaped one. His lack of empathy was not a flaw, it was a difference. And then the first signs came. Silhouettes at night. Unlocked doors. An abandoned car. But no real trace. Like a nocturnal animal, he left clues but no tracks. It was as if he knew fear only grows when logic fails. And the more people tried to understand what he wanted, the stronger the question became, what if he wants nothing? What if the void itself is the fuel? In biology, there are predators who don't hunt out of hunger. They hunt out of instinct. Out of rhythm. Out of habit. Michael was that. A predator without hunger, only with pulse. An invisible metronome guiding every step. His darkness was not chaos. It was structure. But the true monster was still asleep. Because the world still thought Michael was human. And perhaps, that was his greatest camouflage. The night Michael Myers returned to Haddonfield was not marked by storms or warnings. It was silent. Peaceful. As if the entire town were trapped in a trance. But behind the curtains and the glowing lights, an ancient clock began to toll, not in chimes, but in footsteps. Slow, calculated, and almost ritualistic steps. Because on that night, the irreversible would happen. Loomis was right. Michael didn't want answers. He wanted repetition. And in that cycle, there was a key element, Laurie Strode. Young, studious, part of that clean and orderly world. She had no idea she had been chosen. Not for who she was, but for where she was. A random piece on a board that Michael shaped without anyone noticing. And when she started to realize she was being followed, watched, it was already too late. The town didn't understand. The police, the community, no one saw logic. But there was logic, a logic that couldn't fit into reports. It was the logic of the cycle. Of the return. As if Michael was trying to replay the moment that created him. Psychology calls this reenacted traumatic fixation, the compulsion to relive, in new contexts, a defining event from the past. But in his case, there was no emotion in reliving it. There was necessity. As if that pattern was his only way of existing. While everyone searched for reasons, Michael had already crossed the point of no return. Not because he committed a grave act, but because there was no longer anyone he was before. No boy, no youth, no patient. Only the void operating with precision. He didn't see victims. He saw symbols. And each new action was not impulse, it was repetition. Repetition of an internal pattern that didn't recognize right or wrong. Only sequence. It is at this moment the viewer is invited to a dilemma. Because all society is based on the idea of motivation. We believe people err out of anger, pain, love, madness. But Michael has no motivation. And if there is no motivation, how can we judge? He does not argue. He does not explain. He acts. And that alone deconstructs our belief that every act has an identifiable cause. The scariest thing was not what Michael did. It was what he didn't do. He did not hesitate. He did not look back. He did not run. Because in his logic, there was no risk. He was the risk. And when Loomis finally confronts him, the shock is not with an aggressive creature, but with something worse. A being without emotion, without regret, without hurry. In existential philosophy, there is a concept called the absurd, the idea that the universe has no meaning, and that the human attempt to find that meaning is, in itself, a mistake. Michael Myers is the personification of that absurdity. A being who walks among us not because he wants to destroy, but because existing is already enough. He doesn't need a why. And what if he is right? What if all the effort to find logic in chaos is only a denial that the void is, in fact, real? That night, Laurie survived, but nothing in her remained intact. And Haddonfield was never the same. Because the myth had stopped being a legend. Now it was flesh. It was breath. It was memory. The point of no return wasn't crossed by Michael. It was crossed by all of us. And when we look in the mirror of darkness, do we really recognize who is truly there? How do you explain a being who acts without emotion, without words, without end? Science tried. Psychiatry tried. But the problem with Michael Myers was never a lack of tests, it was the excess of silence. What hid within that silence was more unsettling than any report could contain. Because the absence of human logic can also be a form of logic. Dr. Loomis called Michael pure evil, but that wasn't just a metaphor. It was an acknowledgement of an internal structure that does not operate under traditional human codes. Criminal neuroscience studies show us that there are brains that do not connect to empathy like others. The amygdala, the brain region associated with fear and morality, shows atrophy in extreme cases. In emotional response tests, certain individuals simply do not react. Michael seemed to be one of those cases. But with one difference, he didn't just fail to react. He anticipated. There was coldness in his gestures, precision in his movements. As if his mind operated under its own logic, an internal script that ignored the human factor. Like machines made of flesh. The most frightening part? This condition is studied today under the name antisocial personality disorder with severe psychopathic traits. But even within this spectrum, Michael stands out. He does not manipulate, does not disguise, does not pretend. He exists in the most direct mode of action. He observes, chooses, advances. Not for pleasure, but out of compulsive repetition. Like a machine programmed with a single command, reset the trauma. Some scholars have drawn parallels between Michael Myers and the concept of a functionally empty mind. This theory states that in extreme cases of emotional disconnection, the individual begins to act solely based on environmental stimuli, as if driven by patterns rather than feelings. This explains the way Michael acts. He doesn't seek. He responds. Laurie, for example, was not chosen out of love or revenge. She was a point on the map. A symbolic repetition of the original pattern. That is why he always returns to the same place, on the same day, with the same mask. The mask, by the way, is a perfect symbol of his mind, expressionless, emotionless, without identity. Only function. The logic behind Michael Myers is so terrifying because it makes sense, but a kind of sense no one wants to accept. He is a mirror of something that exists but that we deny. And that is the root of true horror, not the impossible, but what is real and ignored. And when we look at other names that have marked horror, we notice the pattern. Characters who do not scream, do not justify, do not hesitate, only follow. Because following is what they were made to do. As if evil, in its purest form, needs no intention. Only constancy. Michael is not a mistake of nature. He is a product of it, taken to the limit. A brain that eliminated everything we call human and left only the essential to survive, the functional repetition of what created it. And in the end, what studies show is this: perhaps the horror is not the unknown. Perhaps the horror lies in understanding too much. Because when everything makes sense, the monster doesn't seem so far away after all. And what if his coldness is just the reflection of something we also carry, but have learned to hide? After the fog settles, what remains is not just fear, it is an echo. A trail unseen, but deeply felt. Because Michael Myers was never just a character in a movie. He became a symbol. An archetype. A cultural entity that forces us to face something we avoid, the emptiness within humanity itself. With every return, year after year, film after film, he never changes. Because he does not evolve, he persists. Michael does not need development. He does not need dialogue or redemption. He is the constant. The force that cuts across time, versions, and reboots. And the more people try to explain him, the more he slips away. Because what he represents is not explainable. It is symbolic. After all, what is more frightening, a monster with a tragic past, or a being who feels absolutely nothing? One who has no goal, no pleasure, no pain, only the impulse to exist and repeat. That is what Michael represents. The myth of absence. The shadow that has walked alongside humanity since forever. In ancient mythology, there were figures like Hades or Anubis, cold, impartial entities who merely fulfilled a role. No anger, no love. Just function. Michael is that, brought into the modern world. He is the guardian of a boundary we do not want to cross, admitting that evil may have no reason. And the most disturbing part is the legacy this leaves. Because when a figure like this takes hold of the collective imagination, it does not die. It spreads. Inspires theories, reflects in behaviors, shapes narratives. And more, it forces us to create new monsters, new villains, trying to understand that original one who never gave us answers. Pop culture, for decades, has tried to copy Myers' formula, but no one has ever matched him. Because he is not about exaggeration. He is about the minimum. The basic. The unspoken. He is what remains when all human layers are stripped away and only the form is left. And that form, still walks among us. Michael Myers teaches us, without saying a word, that evil does not need to justify its existence. That chaos does not need to make noise. And that the greatest fear is not what lurks around the corner. It is what lies inside us, in silence, waiting for a trigger. And maybe, just maybe, that's why he comes back. Because as long as there is trauma, repression, absence, and abandonment, something like him will always find space to be born again. Like a shadow that never left. Like a presence that does not move, but waits. Waits for a new cycle. A new face. A new mask. And who can say that he was really the last? In the end, perhaps what scares us the most is not Michael Myers, but the mirror he forces us to face. Because if evil can exist without cause, without pain, without a soul, then maybe we're not so different after all. And the question that remains is simple, yet devastating: when the silence falls, who is really behind the mask?